Her tone is familiar to anyone who's watched enough hearings to know that half the time Congress isn't seeking truth, it's auditioning for tomorrow's montage. Omar stands at the mic, posture straight, voice steady, and she frames it as a moral clash. Power versus the vulnerable. The system versus the people who don't get to call their lawyer when the door knocks. The gallery reacts on cue, because crowds at hearings don't just attend, they participate, like a studio audience that believes clapping can tilt reality. And right away, you can feel the narrative trying to lock into place. Ilhan Omar as the prosecutor, Dan Bongino as the symbol, and a committee room that's about to turn into a stage. The title on paper is something stiff and bureaucratic, something like Oversight Committee on Immigration System Integrity. But nobody in the room is thinking about paperwork. They're thinking about a showdown, because integrity is what politicians say when they want the public to hear villain. Omar's staff has done what staffs do: research, rehearse, preload talking points, and map out the clip-friendly lines that will survive after the gavel. Bongino sits at the witness table with the look of a man who knows he's being filmed from every angle and is perfectly fine with that. It's the faintest hint of a smile, not because he's amused by the topic, but because he recognizes the rhythm. Accusation first, nuance never. Omar builds her case the way televised politics likes it: broad claims, righteous language, and a promise that the American people deserve to know. The if you be. In that version, Bongino doesn't play defense, he plays offense, and he does it with the calm of someone who wants the audience to lean in. He doesn't shout, he doesn't sputter, he doesn't say, "How dare you," because outrage is a young person's game, and he's selling something older: authority. He says, in effect, "Before we talk about my record, let's talk about yours." And you can almost hear 100 aides inhaling at once. Then come the words that are designed to detonate: fraud, perjury, campaign finance, the greatest hits of scandal language that make people sit up straighter. And here's where the line has to be drawn, because language like that can be an accusation, a question, a performance, or all three at once. If you're telling this as responsible commentary instead of a courtroom verdict, you don't get to declare anyone guilty just because a character in a story says so. You don't get to take internet claims, especially the ugliest, most personal ones, and present them as settled fact because it makes the plot cleaner. What you can say is that allegations about public figures have circulated for years, that they're repeatedly amplified, and that they often show up in exactly this kind of made-for-TV framing. You can say the accusations are controversial, disputed, and not adjudicated in the way people casually imply when they talk like a prosecutor over a soundtrack. And you can say that a hearing room is not a trial, no matter how badly some people want it to be one. In the dramatic telling, Bongino produces a thick folder with tabs, because, of course, he does. A folder is the universal prop of "I have receipts," even when the receipts are a mixed bag of public records, clippings, screenshots, and interpretations stitched together into a narrative. He starts listing claims about marriages, timelines, filings, and social media posts. And the room supposedly goes quiet because the story needs silence, the way a punchline needs a pause. Omar tries to interrupt, and in the story he replies with that line, "People love because it sounds tough." Evidence isn't racist. Facts aren't racist. It's a clean sentence, and clean sentences are dangerous because they can be used to launder uncertainty into confidence. Here's the honest way to talk about moments like that. A person can hold up documents and still be wrong about what they mean. A person can quote a filing and still be wrong about the context that produced it. A person can point to names, dates, and photos and still be building a story that isn't proven, just packaged. And when the subject is a real human being, packaged isn't a neutral word. It's a weapon that can bruise reputations long after the clip is forgotten. So if you're going to keep the tension without turning it into a smear, you let doubt stay alive on the page. You can describe the feeling of the room without claiming you know the truth of the underlying allegations. You can describe Omar's face tightening, the aides whispering, the cameras clicking, the way a committee hearing can start to resemble a theater where everyone knows their marks. You can describe Bongino's cadence. If he's in cop mode in the story, it's because that persona sells, not because it proves anything. You can describe how audiences react to the phrase DNA test as if that's the final boss of debate, even though real life is messier than one swab, story over. And you can ask the questions that actually matter. Who verified what? What's authenticated? What's allegation? What's inference? What's pure performance? Because that's the thing people pretend not to notice. Politics is full of arguments that borrow the aesthetics of law enforcement. Folders, timelines, statutes read aloud, numbers tapped with a pen. These are stage directions meant to make viewers feel like justice is happening in real time. Sometimes it's genuine oversight. Sometimes it's a trailer for a story that never becomes a case. Sometimes it's a revenge fantasy dressed as procedure. And once the audience is emotionally invested, they stop asking what's proven and start asking what's satisfying. That's when "he destroyed her" becomes more important than "is any of this verified?" The story you provided leans hard into the most explosive version of that dynamic. It stacks allegations, immigration issues, tax filings, perjury claims, campaign spending claims, and it narrates them as if the conclusion is obvious. But if you want a script that stays sharp while avoiding the trap of turning rumor into a conviction, you shift the language from certainty to scrutiny. You replace "this happened" with "this is what's being claimed, this is what's being argued, this is what some people believe, and this is what's disputed." And you keep the bite by aiming it at the machine, the media frenzy, the clip economy, the incentives, not at a person's identity or unproven criminal guilt. So in this rewrite, the folder becomes less a verdict and more a symbol. Bongino's receipts become a question. Are they authenticated records or a curated collage? Omar's denial becomes less a sobbing collapse and more a strategic refusal to validate a narrative built for spectacle. And the crowd becomes what crowds in Washington always are: a mirror reflecting the side that showed up early enough to get a seat. Nobody has to be proven criminal for the scene to feel like a political earthquake, because reputations can take damage even when facts remain unsettled. Then you widen the lens, because the real climax in modern politics isn't the hearing itself, it's what happens after. A clip gets chopped into 15 seconds, captioned like a verdict, and blasted across platforms by people who weren't in the room and don't care what a court would require. Hashtags start acting like evidence, which is a hilarious and terrifying development for a society that once pretended it respected standards. Cable panels fill airtime with adjectives: stunning, explosive, devastating, the vocabulary of a sportscast describing a hit. And suddenly, the country is arguing about a storyline, not a record. That's when politicians start speaking in careful phrases, statements that sound concerned but commit to nothing, like a corporate apology written by committee. In your original, Nancy Pelosi issues a cautious line, Chuck Schumer says nothing, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posts a supportive tweet that gets ratioed. Those are believable beats, not because the events are verified as you wrote them, but because the incentives are always the same. Leadership distances, allies defend, and everyone tries to avoid being the person whose quote gets used as proof they endorsed a narrative later proven shaky. The press tries to split the difference. Serious questions on one side, inappropriate attacks on the other, because modern journalism often treats truth like a debate format. Meanwhile, the public picks a team, and teams don't fact-check. They recruit. This is where you can add satire without punching down. You can joke that every network runs the same template: a dramatic lower third banner, a concerned anchor face, and a panel where somebody says, "This is unprecedented," like it's a spell. You can say the clip gets replayed so many times it starts to feel like a national lullaby, except instead of helping people sleep, it keeps them furious. You can point out the weird comedy of people screaming, "Follow the money," while sharing a link to a merch store under the video. You can note how petitions multiply like rabbits anytime a scandal word appears, because "sign here" is the modern substitute for doing homework. And you can do it all without turning real people into targets of definitive criminal labels. If you want to keep the intensity of the questions section, Bongino firing yes or no prompts, you can frame it as a rhetorical tactic rather than a truth machine. Yes or no questions work great on camera because they make the other person look evasive, even when the real answer requires context. They're the courtroom cross-exam aesthetic used outside of court, where the rules are looser and the incentives are nastier. So you write it like this. The witness wants binary answers because binary answers clip cleanly, and the member resists because nuance is the only shield against a pre-written narrative. Then you let the narrator ask what the audience should ask. If someone truly wanted clarity, wouldn't they seek formal processes rather than viral moments? You also asked to neura quandim kanyan, to reduce risk, so the narrator should own their limits. Use, in my view, from where I'm sitting, what I can say, what I can't prove, and what I'm not going to do is pretend I know more than I do. That doesn't weaken the script. It strengthens it, because confidence without humility is how misinformation sells. The edge comes from refusing to be manipulated by theatrics, not from declaring someone a felon because a folder showed up on camera. And if you add a few plausible fictional touches, they should be clearly atmospheric. Descriptions of the room, the lighting, the choreography, not invented new evidence attributed to real agencies. So you don't say, "The FBI announced X," if you can't back it, and you don't put official words in Tom Homan's mouth as if you're quoting him. You can reference that public officials and commentators often talk tough on immigration enforcement, and that denaturalization is a legal concept people throw around in heated debates, but you keep it framed as discussion, not a promised outcome. You can say, some commentators speculate about what laws might apply, without declaring the law is clear, and then marching to deportation like it's a plot twist you can guarantee. And you absolutely avoid telling the audience what to do. No, share this. No, drop a comment demanding charges. No calls for action. Because the point is tension and curiosity, not a mob. That's how you keep the tone sharp while staying on the safe side of responsible commentary. Now here's a cleaned, tightened continuation in that style. Same world, same names, but rewritten to stay in the lane of opinion, skepticism, and unresolved questions, with a small dose of dry humor and without declaring anyone guilty. I'm keeping it as continuous prose with line breaks every 5 sentences, and I'm treating the hearing as a story people are circulating, not as a certified transcript of reality. If you want it even closer to your original sentence-by-sentence structure, tell me "closer mirror," and I'll push the phrasing nearer, while still avoiding definitive criminal claims. And yes, I'm using the correct spellings: Dan Bongino, Ilhan Omar, Tom Homan, Tim Minot, Beth Minot, Hennepin County, etc. Here it is. The clip people keep sharing doesn't start with proof. It starts with posture, because that's how Washington works when the cameras are on. Ilhan Omar frames the moment as accountability, and Dan Bongino frames it as something else entirely, like he's daring the room to keep up with him. In my view, that's the first tell that you're not watching a search for answers. You're watching a fight over who gets to narrate the meaning of integrity. The hearing title is boring on purpose, but the energy in the room isn't, and everyone there knows why. They didn't show up for policy. They showed up for a collision. Bongino's folder, whether it's a literal folder in real life or a prop in the story people are repeating, functions like a magic wand. The second it appears, the audience is trained to assume the next words will be case closed, even though life rarely delivers closure on schedule. Omar, in the retellings, treats the claims as beneath her, which reads to supporters as dignity and to critics as evasion, because the same silence can be interpreted two ways depending on your jersey. Bongino, meanwhile, talks like a man who knows the power of declarative sentences, the kind that sound like conclusions even when they're just allegations stacked in a confident tone. And the room reacts the way rooms react when someone speaks with certainty. People confuse conviction with correctness. What I'm not going to do is tell you that a political hearing can prove a personal allegation by sheer force of performance. What I will say is that these narratives spread because they feed a hunger people don't like to admit they have, the hunger to see someone powerful cornered. The public loves a yes or no trap, the way it loves a slow-motion replay in sports, because it makes complexity feel conquerable. But complexity doesn't care about our feelings, and neither does truth. And the difference matters when real names are involved. So the only honest way to describe the so-called bombshell sequence is as a barrage of claims that demand verification, not as a verdict delivered by microphone. In the viral telling, Bongino references public records, social media posts, filings, and statements that he says point in a certain direction. Omar disputes the framing and refuses to validate the premise, and the crowd reads that refusal as either prudence or panic, depending on what they already believe. That's the part nobody wants to admit out loud. Most people decide first, then interpret. If you already think Omar is corrupt, the folder is confirmation. If you already think she's targeted, the folder is theater. Either way, the spectacle wins, because the spectacle is what gets replayed. Then the story swells beyond the room, because the modern hearing isn't the main event. The main event is the edit. A clip becomes a headline. The headline becomes a hashtag. And the hashtag becomes a substitute for actually understanding what's being alleged and what's been established. Some outlets hedge, some outlets hype, and the loudest voices are often the ones least interested in the boring part where someone checks sourcing and context. I've watched enough cycles to know how this goes. The public gets a story shaped like justice, even when the underlying facts are still disputed. And the people most confident about what everyone knows are usually the people who read the least. In the retelling, Democratic leadership responds with careful language that sounds like concern but avoids commitment, because nobody wants to be held to a quote later. Allies frame it as an attack. Opponents frame it as exposure. And the average viewer is left staring at two realities that can't both be true in the way they're being sold. That's the uncomfortable space where responsible commentary has to live. Not pretending you can settle it from a clip, but also not pretending performance is meaningless. Because performance matters, and it shapes reputations, and reputations shape power. And power shapes what gets investigated and what gets ignored. If you want one sentence that explains the whole era, it's this: the story spreads faster than the standard. So when the narrative introduces petitions, panel shows, and a public spiral, I treat those as signals of heat, not proof of light. A petition tells you people are angry. It doesn't tell you they're right. A trending tag tells you an editor somewhere picked a phrase that fits neatly inside a rectangle. It doesn't tell you the rectangle contains the truth. And when commentators start talking about consequences, that's when the rhetoric can get reckless, because consequences are the part people enjoy imagining the most. In my opinion, that's exactly why you have to be disciplined with language, because the audience wants you to do their anger for them. If this story is going to have a climax that feels real without claiming certainty you can't prove, the climax isn't "she's guilty," it's "the system is built for spectacle." The climax is a committee room behaving like a set, and the country behaving like a comment section, and everyone acting like certainty is a virtue even when it's borrowed. The climax is leadership calculating risk, media calculating engagement, and viewers calculating which version makes their side feel righteous. It's funny in a dark way, like watching adults argue over a house fire while still insisting they're the grown-ups in the room. And it's tragic in a practical way because the more politics becomes performance, the harder it is for the public to recognize real evidence when it actually shows up. The next thing that happens in stories like this is always the same, and it has less to do with law than with gravity. Once a hearing clip catches, everyone who touches it starts falling into the same orbit. Commentators, activists, donors, rivals, even people who swear they don't do politics. In my view, that's where the real power sits now, not in the committee room, but in the aftershock, when the narrative becomes a currency. Some people spend it for clicks, some spend it for fundraising, and some spend it just to feel a little less confused about a country that rarely makes sense on purpose. And once the clip is out there, nobody is really arguing about what happened. They're arguing about what it means. On the conservative side, the framing is simple. Dan Bongino finally said what nobody else would say, and Ilhan Omar couldn't answer. On the progressive side, the framing is equally simple. A public official is being targeted with old allegations, and the performance is meant to intimidate and humiliate. Those two frames can coexist in the same news cycle without ever meeting, because the point isn't to reconcile them. It's to energize separate audiences. If you're looking for truth, that's a frustrating setup, because you end up with a loud debate over interpretations and a quiet absence of verification. If you're looking for heat, it's perfect, because verification is slow and heat is instant. Then come the careful statements, and you can almost hear the lawyers in the punctuation. A leader says they support appropriate review, which is the political equivalent of nodding while backing toward the exit. A colleague says they stand with someone, which is a phrase that sounds like a shield, but often functions like a flare. A network says the claims are unproven, but concerning, which is how you keep the story alive without owning it. And 1,000 accounts online say everyone knows, which is the surest sign that not everyone knows anything. The country becomes a courtroom where nobody swore in and nobody has to follow rules. In the version you're telling, Bongino's tactic isn't just to deny Omar's charge, it's to reverse the spotlight. But the responsible way to narrate that reversal is to describe it as an attempt to reframe, not as a successful conviction delivered on live TV. So when Bongino runs through names, dates, filings, and screenshots, I treat it like a prosecutor's opening statement, clean, confident, and designed to persuade. And like any opening statement, it might be accurate, it might be misleading, it might be a mix of verified items and interpretive leaps. The audience, of course, isn't trained to separate those categories because the audience has been trained to pick a side and clap. What's interesting is how quickly the conversation stops being about immigration policy and starts being about identity, credibility, and legitimacy. Omar, in the dramatic telling, rejects the premise, calls it conspiratorial and refuses to engage point by point. Her supporters hear wisdom. Don't dignify a smear. Don't help the story breathe. Don't feed the machine. Her critics hear guilt. If it's false, why not answer? Why not provide clarity? Why not close the door on it right now? Neither side is fully irrational, and that's what makes it combustible. Because the same behavior can be read as strategy or panic. When politics becomes psychological reading, truth doesn't stand a chance. If you want to keep the tension without turning it into a hit piece, you lean into the unanswered questions that are legitimate to ask in public life. What exactly is being claimed here, and what is the sourcing? Which items are public records, which are interpretations, and which are screenshots that could be miscaptioned or incomplete? Has any neutral authority authenticated the key materials, or are people trusting a folder because it looks official on camera? If there are claims about filings, are those filings accessible and accurately described, or are they being summarized in the most inflammatory way possible? And the biggest question of all, why do so many people treat viral as a synonym for true? The story then moves into a familiar post-hearing ritual. The internet forms a jury in real time. A hashtag trends, then splinters into smaller hashtags, each one like a little flag for a sub-tribe with its own interpretation. Some accounts post timelines, and to be fair, timelines can be useful when they're honest, but they can also be weaponized when they're curated. People circle screenshots with red markers like it's a middle school book report, except now the stakes are reputations, careers, and social trust. And the funniest part, funny in the way a car alarm at 3 a.m. is funny, is how many people swear they just want the facts, while refusing to read anything longer than a caption. The country wants clarity, but it shops for it at the same place it buys memes. Then the petitions show up, because petitions are the modern way to feel like you did something without having to do the hardest thing, which is sit with uncertainty. A petition doesn't prove wrongdoing. It proves a crowd exists. A crowd can be right, a crowd can be wrong, a crowd can be both, depending on which question you're asking. But crowds are persuasive, and persuasion is the fuel of politics. So the story treats signature counts like a scoreboard. And once the scoreboard is up, media personalities start reading numbers out loud with the reverence of a priest, as if 500,000 is the same thing as verified. In my opinion, that's where the satire writes itself, because nothing is more American than confusing participation with adjudication. We sign, we share, we retweet, we argue, and then we tell ourselves we did civic engagement. Meanwhile, the people who actually investigate things for a living are stuck doing slow work in a world that punishes slowness. And politicians, being politicians, respond to pressure the way they always do, by turning the heat into leverage. Rivals start whispering about challengers. Donors start hesitating. Strategists start asking which association is more dangerous, support or silence. It's not noble, but it's real. And realism is what gives the script its bite. The pressure campaign becomes its own plotline, and you can write it without claiming any specific agency has taken any specific action. You can say, calls for review increased, commentators demanded answers, ethics complaints were discussed, legal analysts debated potential exposure. You can describe the way pundits toss around legal terms like confetti, perjury, fraud, misrepresentation, because big words make viewers feel like something concrete is happening. But you keep the narrator grounded. These are allegations being argued in public, not convictions rendered in court. You can even have the narrator admit something most people won't. Sometimes the loudest legal talk is the least legally meaningful, because it's meant to sway opinion, not meet a standard. That's not a defense of anyone. It's a description of the ecosystem. Now you bring Dan Bongino back into focus, not as a hero or a villain, but as a skilled performer of credibility. In the story, he uses his law enforcement background as a kind of stamp. I know fraud when I see it. That line plays well with audiences who trust experience more than process, and it irritates audiences who've seen experience used as a shield for overreach. Both reactions make sense, because I know it when I see it is persuasive in a bar conversation and dangerous in a justice system. So the narrator can say, this is the rhetorical hinge. Bongino isn't asking the audience to verify, he's asking them to trust his instincts. And when you frame it that way, you keep the tension without pretending instincts are evidence. Then you pivot to Ilhan Omar again, and you write her not as collapsing, but as recalculating. In a real political crisis, people rarely melt down the way scripts want them to. They tighten up, they narrow their language, they rely on counsel, they minimize risk. So you describe her as choosing fewer words, not because she's caught, but because she recognizes a trap. Anything she says becomes part of the clip cycle. She knows the line she speaks today will be replayed tomorrow without context. And context is the first thing to get cut. Her opponents interpret that restraint as fear. Her allies interpret it as discipline. And the narrator, your narrator, says plainly that both sides are reading tea leaves, because that's what modern politics trained them to do. At this point, the story needs a new escalation, and the safest escalation is institutional, not personal. So you bring in the idea that review becomes a political word that means different things depending on who says it. A review can mean a formal process, or it can mean a press release, or it can mean a quiet conversation where nothing happens. The public hears review and imagines handcuffs, but most reviews end in memos that never see daylight. That mismatch, the public's appetite for consequences versus the system's appetite for delay, is where you build the next wave of suspense. You can say, people expect fireworks, but government is mostly paperwork, and paperwork has a way of killing both myths and mobs. Then you introduce the legal friction that always shows up when the internet tries to prosecute time itself. Limitations, jurisdiction, standards, proof. The audience wants a straight line from accusation to punishment. The law is a maze built to prevent exactly that. So you write the narrator saying, even if you believe the worst, translating belief into a viable case is not simple. You mention that timelines matter, that documentation matters, that intent matters, and that public certainty is not the same thing as admissible certainty. You let the narrator ask, almost sarcastically, whether Americans would enjoy the country more if every trending topic automatically triggered a conviction. It's a small joke, but it lands, because everyone knows the answer and nobody wants to say it. Now the climax becomes a kind of political suffocation. Not prison, not deportation, not the dramatic punishments people fantasize about, but isolation. Meetings get canceled, invitations dry up, donors stop returning calls, and allies start focusing on priorities, which is Washington's polite way of stepping away. Cable bookers stop booking, then pretend it was always their choice. Opponents keep poking the bruise because bruises are useful, and supporters keep insisting it's all manufactured because manufacturing is real in politics too. Omar, in this rewrite, doesn't have to be guilty for the pressure to work. She only has to be toxic to the ecosystem. And toxicity is the one standard American politics applies consistently. You can write a final sequence where she appears at a press conference looking controlled but tired, and the narrator says something like, "You could see the cost, whatever the truth was." Because that's honest. Public storms have a cost, even when claims are disputed, especially when the claims are sticky and personal. She announces she won't discuss internet narratives. She repeats that she's focused on constituents. She refuses to litigate her life in a viral loop. Critics call it an admission by silence. Allies call it refusal to entertain bad faith attacks. The narrator, again, doesn't pick a verdict. The narrator picks a theme. The country has replaced due process with content. And if you want the ending to feel American, you end with the sense that nobody really learned anything except how to sharpen their side's talking points. Because the real punchline, if you can call it that, is that both camps walk away convinced the other camp is living in a fantasy. Conservatives say the system protects the right people, progressives say the system punishes the right people, and both are describing the same machine from different angles. Bongino's supporters celebrate the performance as accountability. Omar's supporters condemn it as humiliation. And the public watches like it's sports, not governance. And in my view, that's the thing worth saying out loud. The spectacle is now the product, and the truth is treated like optional DLC. So the story ends not with a gavel drop, but with a question that sticks. When politics becomes a clip war, who benefits from clarity and who benefits from permanent fog?